And welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk all about selectors. Let's go back to our homepage here. We can look at our styles. So far, we've only been selecting elements. But most likely, we need something more than this. So let's go back to our example and look at what sort of selectors we can have. Let's say, for example, that we want the style that we have for the big home header to also apply to our p tag. How can we do that? Well, we can do something like this. I save, refresh. Awesome. So that's a way of doing a selector. And there's actually a whole bunch of things that we can do with selectors. And I created for you a nice little cheat sheet here that I'll attach after this lesson. And it references two really good resources that I recommend. One is the CSS tricks that I've already mentioned, and you can see over here all the selectors that they have. They're not as many as they had with properties, and it's actually not as overwhelming as you think. Probably about 30% of these are the ones that are used most of the time. And we also have our good friend W3 Schools that lists a bunch of the selectors here. So let's go over a few things and understand the main selectors that we have. So I've listed them off for you over here, but I want to point your attention to this line. Cascading style sheets at the most basic level, it indicates, there you go, typo. It indicates that the order of CSS rules matter. And that's something that we've already discussed before. You remember the p tags. So the order matters because we know that the CSS will read the last line and make sure that the color is green. So that's the most basic level. But there's a few other things that we can do. So let's look at the selectors. The first one is class. The class will do something like this. So let's say we want to add a few more p tags here and refresh. Okay, perfect. We love the way everything looks, but ideally for the paragraphs, we want the border to be a slightly different color. So what we can do is we can add something called class. So the class property, we can give it any value we want, whatever we want to call it. So let's call it web text. So now we can copy and paste this class attribute to all the p tags. And if I go back to my style, let's make this, put it up a bit. I can now add period web text. And then from here, you can see that it's highlighted green. And we want the border to be 5 pixels dashed green. Save and refresh. And look at that. So class is a good way to select a group of elements and make sure that they all have the same styles. And we can add multiple ones. So this one can be active. And this adds a second class, which we can say has the text color red. So if we save that, save this as well and refresh, you can see over here that now this is red. So class is very, very useful. Let's look at the next one. The next one is ID. ID is similar to class, except for you can use same ID only once. So let's say that we want to group these p tags by wrapping them in a div. And you might remember this from the HTML section where we talked about this tag that is very, very useful for CSS. For occasions like this where we want to wrap something, so I can do ID equals div1. And if I save this, I can now go back here. And for an ID, you want to do a hash sign, div1. And let's do background blue. Save and refresh. All right, that looks absolutely hideous. You know what? I think this will look really, really good if it had a bit of opacity. So again, we remember RGBA. And if we wanted blue, if you remember, is red, green, and blue. So 255. and then we'll add opacity of, let's say, 0.2. We save that, refresh. All right, that looks a lot better. But now, let's say we copy this and we want to add a second section. Now we would have to call this div2. Again, we want to make sure that the IDs are different. Otherwise, we break the rule. Now, if I save this, we'll have something new, but no styles in this one. We want to add a different style for div2. So again, the selector of div2 will have, let's say this one, instead of blue, has the background red with opacity of 0.2. Let's refresh and look at that. That looks, say, a lot better than it used to. Okay, let's go back to a couple other ones. So this is a star. So the star, it's not used very often, but it symbolizes all elements. So if I do, and usually you'll see stars at the top, but if I do something like this, I can say that we wanted to align everything. Let's say text align, and we want to do right. If I save that and refresh, now we see that this moved to the right, but these didn't. And the reason is because, again, something called specificity. We're saying that, yep, I want everything to be right. But then as we go down the CSS, you'll see that we are saying H2 and P, we want text align to be center. So these elements, instead of coming to the right, get to the center. So just to prove to you that that's correct, if I comment this out, I save and refresh, you see everything moves to the right. Okay, and let's refresh, perfect. The next one is the element, and this is something that we've already seen. You can see over here, we're selecting the element, and then we're putting the property and values. The next one is the element, comma, element. And that is just like we've done here before. We want both H2 and P to have these properties. The next one, and this is a little bit tricky, is element, space, element. And this is a little bit different than the top one because element, space, element, what it does, I'll show you over here. I save this and I refresh, and what just happened here? You'll see that now the text align of center does not apply to these paragraphs anymore. And that's because this syntax of writing a selector means I want you to select all P's that are inside H2. So now even the H2 isn't styled anymore because this says we only want the P's that are inside H2. And you'll see that we have nothing inside H2 other than the text. So if I do something like this, home gnome, I like that, okay. Perfect, I save that and I refresh, you'll see that home gnome is added with these styles. Let's look at the next one. The next one is element greater than element. So this one is a little tricky. So if I go like this and I refresh, nothing's changed, but this says that I want you to select all P's, all paragraphs that have parent of H2. So to show you exactly what that means, let's add this on a new line so you can see better. If now within this P, if we do something like this where we wrap this in a div, like so, and I refresh this, the style didn't get applied because it only wants P's, so paragraphs that are parents of H2, and this P is his parent or her parent is the div, Mr. and Mrs. div. If we put this back to the way it was and refresh, you'll see that this time it works because it's saying all P's inside of H2, which is the case. Hopefully you're still with me. This is as hard as selectors get. So once you know these ones, honestly, you've covered 90% and nothing else will scare you. Okay, let's look at one more, element plus element. So this one, if I go element plus element and refresh, what just happened? this says select any P element that is exactly after an H2 element. So what does that mean? Well, we need to make it so that the P element is right after the H2. So if I go like this, save and refresh, you'll see that now we have our styles applied. Let's look at a few more. And like I said, these ones are probably the hardest. These last ones are kind of fun. Okay, so we have hover. So hover, what that means is if I go over here and I put hover at the end, this means that when I refresh, nothing happens. But when I hover my mouse, look at that. It changes the style to what we just wrote down over here. This one's a pretty cool one, especially for buttons. The next one, if we look over here, is last child and first child. And you might guess what that means. So a good way to demonstrate this is we want to use web text. So web text, as if you remember, is all these little lorem ipsums. I can say in here, last child, refresh, and only the last child of each web text. And you'll see here that there's two of them because it is selecting the last child, this one and this one. And then there's also first child, which, as you can imagine, if I refresh, it selects the first items. And then finally, I wanted to show you one last thing that I don't recommend, but you might see it in some code bases, so I don't want you to be surprised when you come across it. And that is this. So I can add something like exclamation mark important here. And you'll see again, we get that nice highlighting. And important means, let's see what happens here. I refresh and everything just turned pink. Even though this P over here says I want the color green, important overrides any of the cascading style sheet rules and says, hey, I don't care what anybody else says, the P is pink. And you can see here why I don't recommend using this. Because although you know for sure that the P tags will be pink, if somebody else comes and starts working on your style sheet, and maybe this is hundreds of lines, and they don't know that the important tag is there, they can be confused as to, hey, how come nothing's turning green? I can play all around with the color here and nothing's happening. And again, it breaks the rules of cascading style sheets. So you don't really want to use it. But again, if you see it out in the wild, you won't be surprised this way. The last thing I want to leave you with is the idea of specificity. If this is your first time running into it, it might get a little confusing and you do need a bit of time to get used to it. But trust me, you'll get there. It's just one of these things that everybody goes through and eventually you'll have an aha moment. When selectors win out in the cascade, it depends on three things. So the first thing is specificity. And I have a resource here that really explains it well. A simple way to think about this is how specific is your selector. So this has a specificity score here. This has a little bit higher because it's more detailed, it's more nested, and this one is higher. This one is even higher, and you can see that it keeps going higher and higher. So the more specific something is, the more likely it will win out and make sure that that is the style. And there's actually a really fun specificity calculator. It's really hard to say that word. So if you click over here, you can type in whatever you want. So let's say A, for example, is just 1 point. But if I do Li, that's 2. And if I do Li, that's even higher. And if I do A, it's even higher. But then I add an ID of food. You can see that IDs are even higher. And then if I add another class, let's do blue, you'll see that the specificity increases. And you'll see over here that inline styles is actually the highest. So if you remember, that is putting a style directly into a section, that will always win out over others. So you can play around with this, and I will link to some of the resources that I have in the next section. But again, this is something that will be very specific once you get to a certain problem. You can figure it out, but I hope that makes sense. Let's go back over here to the last two things. So the other thing was the importance. Importance is, as I mentioned, this exclamation mark important. So that always depends on what kind of styles the Cascade gets. And then finally, it is the source order. And that is, let's go back to our index file. If we had another style sheet here, let's say we're importing another style sheet. And if you remember, we have style 2 here that makes the H2 color blue. If I put this in, save, and let's go back to our website and refresh, this turns blue because our browser reads this style sheet and then reads this one. And because this one happens after this, the later style gets added. So if I switch this over here, and let's make sure that the H2 has its own style. So let's do H2 color red, refresh. You'll see that this style wins out. Okay, I'm gonna leave this out for you. In the next section, you can play around with CSS and some of the selectors, but this is the hardest it's gonna get. And once you remember these rules, you're all set. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.